say, not to interrupt your conversations, but one, it is 12 o'clock and we should try to be punctual. And second, I need the collective to be mindful that I don't run over because I'm supposed to join a Zoom meeting at 1 o'clock. And we have been known to go into overtime. Right? So all the brilliant questions that you ask at the end, don't wait till the end.
Save your brilliance for another time.
Okay.
Well, we could do that, or you could just ask the question
At the beginning.
at the beginning.
Okay.
Okay, let me,
What chapter and verse?
we are in, oops.
Thank
you, Sam. We are in chapter 23, verse 8. So we are in Parshat Ki-Teitzei, chapter 23, verse 8.
11:22.
Thank you.
11:26.
11:22.
Verse 8 something.
11:23.
11:23.
11:23.
Okay. Fortunately, those are next to each other, so
That's very good.
convenient.
Thank you.
Just a word or two of preface before we jump in. One, Parshat Ki-Teitzei has the distinction of having the most mitzvot of any portion of the Torah. The downside of that is that the parsha is in many ways incredibly disjointed, where you just sort of feel like every verse or two, or if you're lucky 3 or 4, you're jumping from one topic to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And depending on how far into the parsha we get, we will discover that. Second, because we are we decided that we would sort of try to follow the triennial cycle in terms of the material that we do here in class, since that's what we're going to be reading on Shabbat. We often jump into kind of the middle of a section. So even though we're technically going to start reading chapter 23, verse 8 on Shabbat, I'm going to just read for you the beginning or the prelude to this, because the context kind of is important. And the broader context is who is allowed to enter into sacred space. We saw some of that with regard to the Kohanim back in the book of Leviticus, and we see here some more of that as it applies to more ordinary Israelites. And here it is, once having dealt with the sacred space, in verse 4, it starts to deal with people who are ineligible to become members of Israelite society. They are permanently barred from citizenship, if you will, to use a more modern term for an ancient phenomenon. All right, so verse 4, no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, which in biblical terms means forever, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt, and because they hired Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor of Aram Naharaim to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to heed Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, for the Lord your God loves you. You shall never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. All right, that's sort of the preamble. So how does the Bible seem to feel about Moabites and Ammonites?
Not well.
All right. I'd say 2 thumbs down, but this is more like 10 thumbs down. Right? And I do that because verses 8 and 9 are the sort of the converse. You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your kinsman. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you are a stranger in his land. Children born to them may be admitted into the congregation of the Lord in the third generation. In other words, there's a waiting period for descendants of Edomites and Egyptians, but eventually they are welcomed and welcomable into the community of Israel. So my question to you is, why do the Edomites and the Egyptians get a welcome and a pass, whereas the Ammonites and Moabites are bitter, endless enmity? Go ahead,
There's an
Sam.
Answer. Esau would have been from Edom. Esau was Jacob's brother.
Okay,
So even though he's not, high in the order. And the other is that I don't remember the name now, the concubine for Abraham,
Hagar,
Hagar, the son, I think, is considered
Ishmael.
Ishmael, Egyptian. I don't know that.
Okay, so
It's family.
they're family.
Yeah, but
Okay,
distant
so
family, right?
you, all right, Rhoda. You're
Muted, Rhoda.
One might be that the Edomites, the Egyptians, were a threat to our physical being, whereas the Moabites and the Ammonites, with the way they worship God and try to get us to, was more of a spiritual threat. It went to our souls.
okay, but if I threaten your physical existence such that you no longer exist, doesn't that sort of make your spiritual life kind of null and void?
Yes, but the idea, they're using them as an example.
I don't know that you can necessarily say that. It doesn't say
Okay.
such as, it's very, very specific. Let's go, think a little deeper, all right? And think about what was, so the Moabites and the Ammonites try to curse us and they fail, right? They fail. And the Ammonites, they don't even try to curse us. That's the Moabites. The Ammonites just didn't bring you takeout. It's not even that they were aggressively in opposition to you. They just weren't nice along the way. And by the way, the Ammonites are descendants of whom? You haven't memorized all the genealogies in Genesis?
No,
Come on, guys.
The ones.
Noah.
Well, descendants of Noah is a little easy because we're all technically descendants of Noah.
Yeah, but he was the ones that they had with his daughters.
They're descendants of Lot.
Okay.
Okay, so yes, they're so they're if you want to use the argument of family, well, Lot was Abraham's nephew, so Lot's descendants are closer relatives to us than, let's say, the Egyptians. Right? Right? So in some ways, it's kind of perplexing. The Ammonites don't really seem to do something all that terrible, and yet they're proscribed in perpetuity. The Moabites try and fail. Okay. The Edomites and the Egyptians are actually in opposition to Israel. All right. The Egyptians, in some ways, are historically irrelevant, other than the fact that we were slaves there for several centuries. And Moses, think about this. Theoretically, this is Moses speaking 40 years after the Exodus. And he's going like, you know what, the Egyptians, be nice to them. We were guests there. And I'm thinking like, if that's how they treat their guests, please do not invite me.
I have two parallels. One is Vietnam. We have people going back to Vietnam in spite of the fact we fought them. For Nazi Germany, just the opposite. It's German and therefore we don't do it. We won't buy it. We won't even play Wagner at a wedding. And it's sort of like the stigma is still there. So I realize the 4 years have passed for Egypt. So I just brought those two up so they could comment on it.
Okay, well, I can't speak to the Vietnam one quite as easily, but intriguingly, that animus towards things German is much more pronounced in some ways in the diaspora than it is in Israel, where Ben-Gurion was faced with the difficult choice of, do we accept reparations? And Ben-Gurion for everything else was an incredible pragmatist. And he decides, yes, we are going to take those blood money and we're going to use it to create the Jewish state.
Okay.
Right. Plus, German vehicles were, I don't know if it's still quite as large a market share, but there was a time when German vehicles were like the single largest selling car in Israel. Whereas many people here would go like, oh, no, I'm not buying a German-made car.
Right.
Now, I'm not sure what that means, other than maybe there was a pragmatism or let's get past it mentality, and we'll do what is beneficial in the present,
Okay.
which may be part of it here, because Egypt is, for lack of a better descriptor, a global power. Right? They are the counterweight to whatever group is predominant in Mesopotamia, whether it's the Hittites or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians, whoever happens to be the power block over here. They're the ones who are constantly fighting with the Egyptians. So maybe it's an element of pragmatism. I'm not sure. And just as a footnote, even in Israel, however, they don't play Wagner at weddings, because there's certain trappings that are. I guess there's a difference between pragmatism that says I'm going to accept these monies because I can use them to benefit the Jewish people, as opposed to I don't need to hear the strands and strains that were really elevated under Nazism.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So it's just an interesting opposition where the offenses of the first group seem relatively minor, whereas the offenses of the latter group, which seem much more consequential, seem downplayed. The other piece of it, some modern biblical scholars have raised two interesting ideas. One is ignore the history and who are the bad guys around the time the book of Deuteronomy is being composed, right? The Israelites are not at odds with the Edomites or the Egyptians. They are at odds with the Ammonites and the Moabites, right? So that's one theory. The other is a little harder to quantify, which is to what degree is the text of Deuteronomy influenced or emergent from the northern kingdom, or by, if not emergent from the northern kingdom, those in opposition to the Davidic dynasty, right? Because To whom does David trace his lineage in part? Okay, I'll give you a clue. It's on mom's side.
To Ruth.
To
Yeah,
Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite. All right. And in part, the entirety of the book of Ruth is to almost demonstrate why, despite this edict, Ruth is welcomed into the community because of her personal stellar qualities that make her worthy of inclusion, despite the fact that she's a Moabite. It also helps that she's a woman, in that if Hebrew is a very gendered language, and the text here is written from do not allow Mr. Moabite, as opposed to Ms. Moabite. And part of it is a reflection of the way society operated in the ancient world, wherein, by and large, when a person took a bride, the bride moved into the orbit of the husband and was sort of absorbed into the clan. So when Rivka leaves the old country and moves to Canaan to marry Isaac, she is swallowed, if you will, by the clan of Abraham, and therefore whatever religious stuff got is sort of marginalized and muted. And that was kind of how, if you will, conversion took place before the process of conversion that we now are familiar with. Right?
Okay.
It was absorption. And but it was imperfect also, because there's a great tension between about how you do that. Right? One of the biblical concerns, and one of the reasons why the Torah emphasizes get rid of all the people who are native to the land, is because there's concern that the Israelites will be assimilated, thank you, by the existing population, and if not completely assimilated, significantly influenced. When the exiles come back from Babylonia, there's a huge push for those who have remained in the land to divorce their native-born wives, not the Jewish ones, the Israelite ones, but the Babylonians played shift the population. So they would bring people from different places to fill the void created when they exiled you, because their presumption was, if you're not in your own land, you're less likely to try to rebel. So when the Israelites and the kingdom population of Judea are expelled to Babylonia and other places, let's say just say Babylonia, they bring other people and plant them in there. The Jews who are left are now intermarrying with those people. The Jews who have sort of preserved their identity come back and go like, oh, heck no. You want to be a full recognized member of the Jewish community? Yeah, get rid of that spouse and get rid of those children, and we'll just have a do-over for you. And I don't want to comment on that from the perspective of us in the 21st century, but that was how things operated, because there was this real concern about don't use this term out of context, cross-contamination. It's part of why Abraham says to his servant, you go bring the bride here. And he says, what if she doesn't want to come? Can I bring Isaac? No. Isaac does not leave this space. You bring her here to disconnect her from her roots so that we can, quote, train her up right. Okay. It's one of the reasons also why even today, even though the process of conversion has changed significantly, it is by and large, I mean, I'm sure there may be some exceptions to what I'm about to say, but there's an expectation that a person who is brought to the Beit Din has a sponsoring rabbi who connects that person to to a congregation and therefore to a Jewish community. Because you don't convert in a vacuum. That's not how Judaism kind of operates. It's not a personal faith religion. You know, it's a religion that functions within the context of a community. So I suppose theoretically, there could be someone who is living in middle of nowhere, Montana, who connects through the internet to a rabbi and says, I would like to study for conversion. And does so and you know, would have to go somewhere to complete the process, you know, in terms of going to the mikvah and really just the mikvah, because theoretically you could even do a rabbinic court on Zoom. But I would wonder how that person could function Jewishly without a Jewish community in which to be embedded. You know? Doing Shabbos in isolation or even on Zoom is not the same. Doing Pesach Seder on a computer, having had to do it during the first year of COVID, I can tell you that it sucketh.
Right.
That's a very biblical term because I put the ETH at the end. All right. So park that because we're changing topic. Right? It's right. We're now at verse 10. When you go out as a troop against your enemies, be on your guard against anything untoward. That's not military strategy, you'll see. If anyone among you has been rendered unclean by a nocturnal emission, he must leave the camp, and he must not re-enter the camp. Toward evening he shall bathe in water, and at sundown he may re-enter the camp. Further, there shall be an area for you outside the camp where you may relieve yourself. With your gear you shall have a spike, and when you have squatted, you shall dig a hole with it and cover up your excrement. Since the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and to deliver your enemies to you, let your camp be holy. Let him not find anything unseemly among you and turn away from you. Right? This is not a military strategic piece of advice. This is how do you run your camp, right? And it's important to appreciate this within the context of the Israelite concept of war. In the Bible, God is the warrior who does the fighting, right? You see it early on in the story of the Exodus and in the Song of the Sea, where it talks about God as the warrior. That's the image of God at the Song of the Sea, right? God was believed to be present in the Israelite camp above the ark, and God is described as Israel's myriads of thousands of troops, and the Israelites are the Lord's ranks. They're the rank and file. God defeats the enemies of Israel by turning the forces of nature against them, or in some other manner incapacitating them. Right? The best imagery of this is the Exodus. You got the plagues, you've got the splitting of the sea, you've got the drowning of the Egyptians in the sea. Right? What do the Israelites do during military campaigns? Well, either they stand passively by, see the Exodus, or they sent an army whose role was to assist by finishing off the enemy that God had delivered. The belief in this idea was expressed in part through prayer and sacrifice before battle, by bringing the ark and sacred vessels with you to battle. Because if God is present and hovers over the ark, you bring the ark with you so that God is with you. And you sound trumpets in order to be remembered before God. But essential, therefore, is keeping the camp fit, devoid of all forms of impurity or defilement, because impurity and defilement will banish God's presence. And if God is your primary military strategy, you don't want God leaving. Battles in the Bible are undertaken by the command of God, and as we saw with the story of the spies, the refusal to go is seen as an act of faithlessness and rejection of God, and it does not end well. Gerhard von Rad, in a book called Holy War in Ancient Israel, talks about this phenomenon, but he is very, very quick to emphasize that his use of the term holy war is not what we have come to understand the term to mean. Okay? And I quote him directly now. The idea of spreading Israelite religion to foreigners and compelling them to accept it is completely foreign to the Bible. In the Bible, the acceptance of God on the part of non-Israelites is completely voluntary and is meant to be a response to seeing God's greatness.
When was that written?
Gerhard von Rad?
Yeah.
Von Rad is, I'll say, early 20th century. Right? So, yes, it is after all of the holy wars of the Middle Ages and beyond. But it's fascinating how the idea of holy war, in which you are representing God in that war, is really, in some ways, almost the antithesis of the biblical model.
And you're carrying the ark because it's there, rather than the ark is not something which has some sort of power. I'm not trying to raise the lost ark.
Right. It's in the okay. So in the Bible, in many cases, the ark was seen as the conveyance of God. So you brought God with you when you went to go to battle because God's presence was there. And if you were on the wrong side of God, boy, you were gonna get smacked. Right? It's interesting, though, that in the book of Deuteronomy, where we are, war is in many ways desacralized, and while it shares the belief that God fights on behalf of the Israelites, it does not ever indicate that the ark accompanies the army into battle. It never connects God's presence in the camp of the Israelites with the ark, and it doesn't place God in a physical venue. So in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses does not connect God's presence to physical objects like the ark or the Mishkan, the way we've seen it previously. In part, I think we're both there's an evolutionary piece of it in terms of belief models, but there's also a transformation in that after the time of Solomon, where is the ark parked? In the temple in Jerusalem. It never leaves until the temple is destroyed. And the book of Deuteronomy is post David and Solomon, and therefore probably represents this idea of course we don't take it with us because it's got a permanent residence. It's not like the Mishkan where it's portable. It's now permanent. Right? The idea of God as present in the camp, as reflected here, is a little unusual, and may in fact suggest that this snippet of legislation is a vestige of, and it doesn't mention the ark and other stuff, but it does preserve the idea of preserving the sanctity of the camp, so that even though God is not depicted as physically there, the idea of God accompanying the army remains true, right? And we didn't really trip over these because they didn't come up in things that we studied. But if you look carefully at the book of Deuteronomy and how it talks about things that happen, I see your hand, Bill. Hold on a sec. All right.
Thank you.
The events at Sinai, right? Talk about, if you read it in the book of Exodus, the presence of God descends onto the top of the mountain, and there's cloud and fire and lightning and da 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 da. Very, very physical.
Very Spielberg.
Okay. Well, I think he stole it from the Bible. Okay. But when Moses talks about it in the book of Deuteronomy, he says, regarding the Israelites' encounter with God at Sinai, Min hashamayim hishmiacha Adonai Elohecha. From the heavens you heard the voice of the Lord. From way, way, way up there, not over there at the top of the mountain, because that's already too physical, right? And then when it talks about the single location which God will choose for a permanent place for the temple, if you will, it says, Lishachein Shmo Sham, the place where God will have his name present. Right? In other words, this temple will be dedicated to God, to the name of God, but you can go there because it's a place God pays attention to, but it's not like in the description of the Mishkan where God's resting between the wing, above the wings of the Kruvim in the Holy of Holies. It's a place of divine attention. It's a place that's associated with the divine name, but don't for 1 minute think that God is present in that space in a way that is radically different than God is present in any other space. Okay, Bill.
Thank you. I was going to ask, do the scholars think that any of the Torahs back from the fall of the ancient temple still exists, or what's maybe the oldest Torah is still around?
Okay, so the oldest biblical passages or remnants that we have are the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And that is fragments at best. If my memory serves me correctly, there are several manuscripts that date back to like the 10th and 11th century. The best of which I believe is the Leningrad Codex. Okay, it's Leningrad because that's where it geographically found itself. So I don't know that there's any document specifically of the entirety of Torah that is older than that.
Thank you.
You want some water?
No, I'm going to take another sip of this
Okay,
because it worked so well the first time.
okay.
Okay.
No.
Not especially, but that's okay. We shall press ahead. All right. So what starts with when you go out as a troop against your enemies and you're thinking, okay, military strategy. No, what's your big military strategy?
Hygienic.
Be hygienic and pure. Don't do anything that will spiritually defile your camp and cause God to leave, because your big weapon is the big guy. Okay. Any last thoughts about this little section before we move on to the next one? Okay. Verse 16. You shall not turn over to his master a slave who seeks refuge with you from his master. He shall live with you in any place he may choose among the settlements in your midst, wherever he pleases. You must not ill-treat him. Okay, so what's going on here?
Cough drop.
Nah.
With that big stomach, were you still on a cough drop?
No, I think I've drowned the frog. But thank you.
Okay.
All right, so what's happening here? And I remember I told you we jump from topic to topic. This has nothing to do with what came before it, and it will have absolutely nothing to do with what comes after it in verse 18.
You have to protect runaway slaves.
Okay, so the question is, why? All right, and by the way, this
Because
lies
we
in
were
the,
slaves.
what?
We were slaves, so you're
But
supposed to
Israelites are
protect-
allowed to own slaves.
I don't know.
No, this is why it's so bizarre. All right. Understand that in the ancient world, allied states had an obligation and a requirement to extradite slaves back to their original place.
Yeah.
All right. There are examples of temples throughout the ancient world where people, including slaves, could be granted asylum, that those were usually temporary situations, and it allowed for a measure of adjudication wherein the slave owner might be required or compelled to modify his behavior toward the slave. And if they can't find a common ground, the ultimate resolution might be the sale of the slave to yet a third party owner. Right? So it was in some ways, you think you can escape slavery by crossing the border? No, right? It's not like, this is not the Underground Railroad. It was, you and your neighbors had treaties, and part of it was your return, right? So for the Israelites to negate sort of this is a negation of common practice in the ancient Near East, wherein the extradition of slaves was specifically prohibited. And not only could you find asylum by going to a sanctuary or a temple from this legislation, the entire land of Israel becomes that sanctuary, that asylum, that safe space. And the footnote to the whole thing is, by the way, it's wonderful. You now have a resident alien amongst you. You have allowed this person, in fact, you are required to allow this person to settle in the land, but you may not mistreat that person because what is that person bringing with them? Garnished, nada, nothing in terms of resources and assets, right? How is Israelite society structured? Land. It's an agrarian society. How do you get land?
Or you inherit.
You inherit it,
Yeah.
right? Because land, even if you buy it, reverts to original ownership at the end of a certain period of time, which means that you are allowing a whole population to enter the country without any real resources, in which case they are potentially, are not potentially, they are in all likelihood to end up on the bottom of the socioeconomic bottom stratum of the socioeconomic ladder. And you've got to, and though people at the bottom are usually the ones who are most mistreated. And therefore, there's an expansion of what you might have an obligation to an Israelite to do, to say, well, you're welcoming this person, you also now have obligations toward this person.
That caused a lot of conflict, or did you run away further from the neighborhood?
No, this was cross-border. This was not
Oh, not
going,
within.
this was not going from Williamsburg to Newport News, right? And also, it raises several questions also of how does this deal with Israelite slaves, with Hebrew slaves, right? So theoretically, this was international law. So if an Israelite slave ran from, let's say, the tribe of Zebulun to the tribe of Asher, it's like, no, sorry, here you go, right? But there are, so some scholars suggest that this legislation is just an expansion of what was true for Hebrew slaves. But more likely, since this is how you deal with foreigners rather than native born, more likely the Torah also already has a whole host of rules and regulations that place limitations on your treatment of Hebrew slaves, right? Your period of servitude is limited. Your period of the reasons for which you can become an indentured slave is because you are trying to resolve financial problems. If you decide you like living in your new master's house, you can choose to stay, which suggests that it was not a bad existence or bad enough for you to want to leave.
I want to go back. This is me. You got the label, you're a slave. What happened to Genesis? You're created in the image of Almighty God, and therefore you should be treated equal.
That's not what it says.
Well, that's why you're the rabbi and I'm not, but okay.
It says you are created that all people are created in the image of God.
Right.
Okay. It does not necessarily say that all people will be treated equally. It just may suggest that people may not be treated badly because I can't obviate your sanctity, but it is abundantly clear that the Torah recognizes a stratified society.
So I threw in the Declaration of Independence in it. So, okay, that's probably it.
Yes,
Okay.
I mean, it's a lovely document. Be nice if we ever get to actually live by it, but
But it was.
look, it was written as aspirational. It's still aspirational. might be a little, disappointing to the founding fathers that we haven't moved farther along that aspirational ladder, but it is a reality that societies are stratified and the Bible recognizes it. Because otherwise you can't have Hebrew slaves. But if I do allow Hebrew slaves, there are limitations on what you, the slave owner, may do in your treatment. And if you violate those, you lose you lose the slave as property or for that period of rental, because you only get to rent them. You don't get to keep them necessarily.
7 years.
I hear what you said.
You're supposed to be released in year 7.
Got it.
All right. Now, that raises the question of why would someone choose to remain in the household of someone else?
That's not a hard one. If you're treated well.
Oh,
and
okay.
not-
If you're
and
treated
not
well,
and you have nothing, then why go out there and be poor
okay.
and
But
scramble?
okay, but remember, the Torah says that when your period of servitude is up and your master is going to release you,
Then you get that peg in your ear against the door.
no, that's only if you want to
You
stay.
want to stay.
No, but if I want to leave, you, the owner, have an obligation to help me get set up on my feet.
How would that work, Raveling?
I'm not entirely sure.
You can't, if they couldn't inherit.
Well, who could?
Or could the former
The
owner?
foreigner, so let's say Joe Schmo has a piece of land. But like me, he has a black thumb, which means that everything he plants dies. A cruel and horrible death. Right? The plants are withering and suffering and going, God, please smite us because we can't take this anymore. Right? But theoretically, what's happened? All right. Either that piece of land has lain fallow, or the person's family is working the land and he's paying off whatever debts he accrued because, and this is, not so uncommon in agricultural, right? I need to buy seed in order to plant. Why? Because my crops failed and I wasn't able to, siphon off a certain measure of crops in order to start the new season. So I got to borrow money or seed in order to cultivate the next year's crop. And in addition to seed, I might actually need to rent an ox in order to help, or a team of oxen to do the plowing. This is farming 101,
Goes on today.
It goes on today. I need to buy seed. I have to borrow money to buy the seed that I'll pay back when I harvest and sell my crop, which if it fails, I am in real trouble because I now have I have nothing to sell to get the money to pay back the person or company that I borrowed from. But theoretically, so I may decide, you know what? I'm not going to suddenly become a better farmer. It's comfy here. I don't have to think as hard. I don't have to work as hard because success and failure is on him. I have a place to live. I have my family is with me and they have a place to live. And I eat. It's like Ganook. No, not everybody wants that sense of independence because the sense of independence also comes with a whole lot of obligations and responsibilities. So you might see why someone might choose to say, it's okay, I'll stick it out. But if I decide I want to go, you, the owner of me, quote, or the renter of me, whatever you want to call me, that person, has an obligation to provide me with the pardon the phrase, the seed money to allow me to be successful going forward and not end up back in poverty and in servitude again a few years down the road. From a biblical perspective, the idea of creating future viability is better than perpetuating people in a state of poverty. You know, I suppose you could make that same argument today that if we were able to overcome some of the issues of poverty, we would societally be uplifted because we wouldn't have to spend money to grapple with all those problems if we actually solve them. You know, my kids went to Albany High School. Albany High School, as its name might imply, was the high school that served Albany. Right? Yes, I know that's a brilliant insight on my part. Right? Albany High at one point made a determination that actually it was a school district thing, but we didn't learn about it till the high school because our kids went to a Jewish day school through middle school. Served breakfast and lunch.
Oh, they were poverty school.
But they served breakfast and lunch to everybody because they did not want to stigmatize or hide, you know. So any child who went to the high school could get breakfast and lunch. And you could get as much food as you wanted. And if you wanted to, you know, pack something for later, you could. Okay? And they had a mechanism whereby during the summer, because it's amazing, poverty does not take summer vacation. There was a mechanism whereby students could go to the school and receive food in some fashion or other to take home with them. Now, this cost a lot of money. Right? And that's just, you know, an example of some of the issues and challenges that the school had to deal with. It also had to deal with a large dropout rate. Okay. What in the early 21st century does a high school dropout have to look forward to in terms of employment and success? Not much. So, which means it falls on us to provide, which is an expense. It often degenerates into behaviors that are debilitating and problematic. And it costs the society as a whole money. Now, I'm not pretending for 1 second I have the inklings of an iota of an idea of how you solve this. Right? But when there are people who are in the system, in the school, in the community, who just accept all of those things as normative, there's no impetus to change the model and see if there's a solution that can be had. And it lacks what I would call a certain long-term thinking about, yes, when the troubled students drop out, it makes it easier for the school. But it's not societally desirable, not to mention the fact that you're just constantly funneling in students into the school who sort of create whatever problems they create until they drop out, which is so.
Always taught entitled
Yeah, but-
funded
Yes.
schools.
Yes, so
It's 5 of 1.
it's 5 of 1.
And you generally like to close the books and you like to put down the AV, so I didn't know whether you wanted to stop me.
Yes, I was sort of hoping we would get to the cultic prostitute, but sorry.
No.
She'll have to wait for 3 years.
Maybe we'll start there for 3 years.
I don't know,
Okay.
maybe I'll talk about it on Shabbat, you never
Make a
know.
note. Oh, that would be controversial. Let's talk about prostitution, okay, and the Jewish answer, okay.
Okay. So, the short answer is that
No.
the description here really is not what we think of as prostitution in all likelihood.
Okay.
It was not necessarily kind, but it was not what we usually think of as
All right.
prostitution.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. It was a very informative class.
My pleasure as always. All right. Thank you for keeping me on track time-wise. I am going to deal with that and get to my next thing.